Hello and welcome to episode number 9 of my podcast, The Wash. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about a book that I read over the past month or so. I finished it about a week and a half ago, and that book is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. But before I get into that, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping, touch upon a few things first before I get stuck into the main part of the podcast. First off, I'm not going to talk about any current news at the moment, regardless of anything that's going on, because it'd just be nice not to think about it for one episode and not to talk about it, because I'm sure, we're all getting enough news about what's going on from other sources and more reliable sources than me, of course. So I won't be covering that today. The other thing is I'm filming by natural light again. So if you watched episode number 8, the last episode, you'll have noticed that the sun slowly went down on my face. That is possibly going to happen again today. It wouldn't have happened if I got stuck into filming straight away, but there were a few minor problems that kind of delayed it, and now the sun might go down on me again. But what can you do? The sun rises and the sun sets, and there's nothing I can do to change that, apart from actually learn how to use my artificial lights correctly. But save that issue for another time. Despite not touching upon current news, as I said, current affairs and the coronavirus, to name it, I mean, it's not bloody Voldemort, is it? I do hope that you're all well and all of your families are well, and you're keeping yourself busy and using this time as a time to further yourself and strengthen yourself, and you're not suffering from too many things like anxiety, depression and the like. If you are, that's fine. I'm sure many people are in that boat. I myself have encountered a little bit of anxiety throughout the course of this situation. But yeah, we'll leave that there and I'll get stuck into the main part of the podcast and talking about Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. If you follow me in any way at all on any platform, you will know that I've just released my website. It's jackandthewash.com, and on there I host my articles and my writing, my podcast. I talk about some films. I also talk about some books, and I've actually already put Never Split the Difference up on the website. Just put that down so I don't play with it the whole episode. Never Split the Difference is up on the website, and I've done like a short write-up of it. I've got loads of book notes for this book, so I'm going to add them as well, as I am with all the other books. But on the website, one of the questions that one of the questions that I pose to myself is, why did I read this book, or why I read this book, why I chose it. The first reason that I read this book, and as is the reason for all other books, is that I'll read absolutely anything you put in front of me. I might not finish reading it, but I'll at least be curious enough to start reading anything. Apart from obviously an IKEA manual or something. But then if I'm bored, then yeah, I would read an IKEA manual. Reason number 2 for reading Never Split the Difference is that it actually has a good reputation. I think it's been recommended by a lot of people who you might consider successful, but also just a lot of people in general. It's got good reviews on all of the sort of review aggregators like Goodreads, but also Amazon as well. And I'd seen it floating around for a while, and a book that stays around tends to warrant its reputation. A concept that Nassim Taleb refers to as the Lindy effect, but really when he uses that, he's talking about books from, a longer time ago that have lasted till now. Reason number 3 for reading this book is that Never Split the Difference is by an FBI hostage negotiator, Chris Voss, and it is about negotiation, and I'm terrible at negotiation. In the book, Chris Voss addresses the reader when talking about bargaining and describing your typical bargaining situation, and he says the following: "Here it is, the clash for cash, an uneasy dance of offers and counters that send most people into a cold sweat. If you count yourself amongst the majority, regarding the inevitable moment as nothing more than a necessary evil, there's a good chance you regularly get your clock cleaned by those who have learned to embrace it. In that sentiment, Chris Voss is describing me, and probably a lot of you as well, in a nutshell. I mean, car boot sales terrify me. Turkish markets even more so. Even someone just asking me how much I think my time is worth, which is obviously a common question that is asked when you're going for a job or you're speaking to a client as part of your job. This is a bit of a problem for me, and it's got to change, because a lot of the time you get what you ask for, and most of the time I just don't even ask at all. If any of the previous applies to you in any way at all, then I highly recommend Never Split the Difference, and I think it will have quite a significant positive effect on your life. First off, I'll say this: Never Split the Difference is exactly the type of book that should be read slowly and deliberately and consciously. There's so much utility in Chris Voss's expertise on negotiation that to do something like read multiple chapters in one day would just be like to constantly displace the information that you learnt from the last chapter as you begin the new one. As with a lot of non-fiction books, really, it's better to read, process, ideally apply, and then carry on reading. It's hard to always get all of those things in, but you at least want to read it and then process it, and maybe even just hypothetically apply it to your own life in a thought experiment or something like that. Just reading this book, you can see in the way that Chris Voss has learnt himself as a negotiator, a lot of the lessons and sort of plans and tactics that he came up with came via making mistakes. So again, that reiterates the importance of learning this stuff and then applying it. You're not going to need all of it. You're not going to be able to apply all of it in all situations, but to do so where you can will really help you internalize the things that you learn within. I mean, in terms of being specific, there's actually a section within Never Split the Difference solely written for the purpose of you negotiating yourself a better salary. I mean, that's something that we could all do with. It's a funny thing, negotiation, because you think that it only applies to sort of work and I guess monetary situations, but in reality it's a constant throughout all of our relationships, our everyday life. When you talk to someone, you're constantly making compromises. There's always an underlying back and forth between you. You're negotiating the terms of your relationship a lot of the time without even fully realizing it. I think it's important to learn this stuff, because if you don't, when you enter these kind of situations, you're going to be going in, and most of the time your counterpart will have a much higher skill in this particular department. And if they're better than you, and especially, as Chris Voss said, if you kind of just consider negotiation as a necessary evil, and you only do it, you only think about it when absolutely necessary, i.e. before you have a negotiation and whilst you're in the room with someone negotiating, then you're going to, again, as Chris Voss said, constantly get your clocks cleaned, and you're going to be getting less than what you deserve every single time. So just to quickly play on that, let's say you go into this room with your negotiating partner or your prospective boss, let's say your prospective employer, and you've gone in and you don't really have much experience. You've thought briefly about what kind of figure you might want for a salary, whereas they know exactly already the specific figure that they're willing to go up to. So they'll set the money aside before the negotiation and then step into the room and they'll lay down this gauntlet for you. There'll be a low end of the offer and there'll be a high end of the offer, and the more tricks and traps that you dodge that they've set up for you, the more likely you are to get the higher end of the offer. If you're like me in any way, you go into these situations and you just want to get out as quickly as possible, and you leave the room thinking, oh yeah, actually 21 grand, that's a pretty good offer, without realizing that that was the lowest possible offer, and actually the highest offer would have been 27 grand. You've just conned yourself out of £6,000 a year. And that, I believe that actually happened to me a while back when I took a job. Luckily I didn't stay in that job for long, but I'm pretty sure that had I done so, I'd conned myself. I mean, that's just a year, so over 5 years, that's 30 grand. You really have to understand that in these situations, you're expected to negotiate. And if you don't negotiate, you're doing yourself a disservice. So that was me in the past, but hopefully, having read this book and having a little bit more knowledge about negotiating skills and how to apply them, I will in the future go into situations and get a little bit more out of it. I mean, I feel ready to do so. It actually emboldened me just to be in a position to say, okay, I know that you're going to lowball me, and now I know about anchors and things like that, so I can set my own anchor price for a negotiation and use all these little tips and tricks that Chris Voss gives you within Never Split the Difference to get something a little bit closer to the figure that I want. I really want you guys to read this book as well so that you can get the same thing, because I do think as individuals, a lot of us are a little bit too nice. And with companies, they're not necessarily trying to con you, as they're trying to keep their wage bill as low as possible because they want to make a profit. They want to keep the company stable, especially in times like these when everything is so bloody uncertain economically, that they're going to give you the lowest possible offer. And you just need to be aware of that. And get yourself a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, one separate really interesting thing about Never Split the Difference is, as you're going through it, Chris Voss talks about these analogies of his life within the FBI and high stakes negotiating with terrorists and the like. Terrorists, bank robbers that are armed, bank robbers that are suicidal, and he realized post situation that he actually had no hope of negotiating with this person after all, and how to spot when this is a situation where negotiation actually isn't possible. And that's really interesting. That kind of keeps the book ticking along, because the tips and tricks are great, but without that kind of personal element, it wouldn't be such a great book. But it's really nice to read about these skills applied in high stakes situations, especially knowing that you're never going to be in such a difficult situation. You're only going to be sitting opposite a client or opposite a boss or opposite an employee even. I guess I'm talking to people as if everyone's an employee. Maybe some of you high flyers out there. In the back of the book, there's also an appendix, a really valuable appendix actually, that gives you an idea of how to create your own negotiation one sheet. So how you can write some sort of script that you're not just going to learn it off by heart and repeat it as is, but you will learn it, and then you'll know, in this part of the conversation, I know that I still have these tools in my locker to go to, these techniques to apply. I mean, your script isn't always gonna go exactly as you want it to, so you've got to be ready to improvise in some way. But it seems like in the book, a lot of the times when Chris Voss gave these techniques and scripts to his students, or he's got his students to write them up, they actually tended to work to a T as long as they stuck with them all the way through. That's Never Split the Difference then. You can get it on Amazon if you want to buy it. I'm sure you can get it on any kind of ebook store as well, but I think most people would use Kindle on Amazon for that. But yeah, you can grab it pretty much anywhere really. Probably get it on Waterstones online. In fact, everywhere online nowadays. And it's probably not going to come particularly quickly, but it's definitely worth the wait. And I definitely think that it's an area that you should upgrade your life in. And I think really, I'm not saying you read this book and you stop there, but reading this book and applying the techniques within is probably enough to, I would say, if you're like me and you're going from zero, then it's probably enough to improve your accuracy or your efficiency in terms of negotiation by about 50 to 60%, maybe even more in some cases. As I mentioned earlier, the book is also on my website and I've done a short write-up there. I'll try and get the book notes up not too long after this. From now on, I think I'm going to be publishing the scripts with the podcasts on my website. Again, that's jackandthewash.com. I think if I publish the script, it's an interesting one. Should I publish the script as it ends up getting performed? I'm not going to write up a transcript because I don't have time for that right now. So I'll just be posting the script that I write before I film the podcast. But the funny thing about that is that the script changes as I film it. So I would say today that I actually ended up cutting like a whole chunk, maybe like 3 or 4 paragraphs out. And I cut it out not because it isn't information that is useful and it wasn't good writing. I think it was good writing, but it was a bit of a segue, and I think I wanted to keep this one quite short. That's the point. Do I post the whole script with that included? I suppose I do. I think I will do that, and then I'll make a little note to say this wasn't actually in the video, something like that. I like doing these meta sort of analyses on the podcast and in public view, because I think it's really interesting for anyone that's watching me do something like this to see how it works and see the difficulties and see where I've struggled. I mean, notoriously or just consistently, one of the most difficult things about this has been the writing of scripts and the performing of scripts, and getting that balance between wanting to make sure you're giving a lot or a high dose of valuable information, but also at the same time not being too cranky and mechanical and sticking to every line of the script. That's really difficult. I mean, that's something I'm even struggling with now still, and I think I will be struggling with until like episode 50. I mean, by episode 50, this could be a completely different beast. I've said in the past that I really want to get into some conversational stuff. Now that's become even more difficult, but yeah, I like to get these things out there, especially because it's very difficult to learn from other people's mistakes, but you can sometimes you can learn from other people's mistakes. And if someone thinking of starting a podcast or some kind of video series watches this and then says to themselves, oh, well, I watched that weirdo and he said that writing scripts and finding the balance between improvisation and scriptedness was a problem, then that might give that person a bit of a head start in terms of thinking about scripting and performing a bit more clearly. It's also because this is very much a working project, and it is primarily about improving myself in every possible area of making a podcast, filming, lighting, just camera work, all that general stuff, improving myself as much as possible, so that maybe in 5 years when I go to do another project like this, I'm way further ahead and I can provide something of much higher value. I think that's a really important way to think about things if you're trying to do a creative project. It's such a cliche and it's so often said and people get bored of it, but you need to focus on the process. You need to focus on what you're doing and not what the outcome's going to be, not what the result's going to be. Because a lot of the time the result is not going to match what you hope the result will be or the effort that you put in. So I can spend a bloody hour and a half setting this up and then filming it, and then I get like 20 views or something on YouTube, or I don't know, 7 listens on Spotify. The Spotify numbers are low, I'll admit that. But because I'm focusing on the process and because I'm purely thinking about improving myself, for now that's not a problem. At some point in the future I will want to change that and figure out how I can change that, but I'm nowhere near that point yet. So that's my unasked for advice for anyone interested in starting something like this. It's funny, I think the hardest part is actually just starting, because I think so many people are scared, and I was and have been scared about putting myself out there for a very long time, and always been scared of what people would think of me. But I think at this point I'm more scared of what happens if I don't try and do something that I want to do, if I don't go for something that is out of the ordinary and that would take me away from an ordinary, what I consider to be mediocre and slightly boring life. Anyway, that was a fat ass segue, and I've just managed to extend what would have been a short podcast into at least medium length podcast. Before the sun goes down, I will conclude and I will say goodbye. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. This has been The Wash, episode number 9. It's on Spotify, just search for The Wash. You can go to my YouTube channel, please subscribe if you haven't already. You find me on Instagram, and of course, most importantly, please check out my website, jackandthewash.com. All I do is on there, and I will keep putting things on there in the future. Look after yourselves, stay healthy, look after your family, and look after your mental health as well, because that's an under-considered thing during these unprecedented times. Okay, don't watch too much TV. Take care, and I'll see you next week.